Friday, I was kicked out of the company like worthless trash. Monday, their billion-dollar contract burned to ashes like tissue paper under the flame I lit. I didn't demand justice back. I rewrote its definition. They thought they were disposing of an inconvenient woman who asked too many questions. What they actually did was unleash someone who already knew all the answers. The rain that soaked through my blazer as I left their building wasn't cold enough to extinguish what was coming for them. My name is Evelyn Mercer, and until 72 hours ago, I was the senior risk analyst who kept Calder and Voss Capital from making catastrophic mistakes. 36 years old, Harvard MBA. 15 years of spotting financial landmines before they exploded. I was the one they called when deals smelled wrong, when numbers didn't add up, when something lurked beneath the polished presentations. I was also the one they fired when I found exactly what they didn't want found. The Grayford skyline blurred through the rain-streaked windows of my former office, as I packed my personal items into a cardboard box. How pathetic, how cliché. The security guard stood by the door, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Poor Marcus. He'd brought his daughter to take your child to work day last month, and I'd spent an hour teaching her about compound interest. Now he couldn't meet my eyes. 5 minutes, Ms. Mercer? He mumbled. I nodded, sliding my MIT alumni mug into the box with deliberate calm. My hands didn't shake. They never did. Not even when David Calder himself had sat across from me 3 hours earlier, explaining how my resistance to collaborative decision-making and inability to align with company vision made my position untenable. Translation: I'd found proof that our landmark deal with Stratodyne Systems, set to close Monday morning, was built on laundered money and falsified valuations. When I'd presented my findings to the board yesterday, they'd smiled those sharp-toothed smiles and thanked me for my diligence. This morning, they'd had HR prepare my termination papers. The USB drive weighed nothing in my jacket pocket, but it might as well have been plutonium. Every email, every doctored spreadsheet, every shell company connection, I'd documented it all. Not because I'd suspected they'd fire me, but because I'm thorough. It's what made me exceptional at my job. It's what made me dangerous to them now. Evelyn. Margaret Chen from legal appeared in my doorway, her Louboutins clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. We need you to sign the separation agreement before you leave. I looked up from my packing, letting silence stretch between us. Margaret had started here the same year I did. We'd grabbed drinks after our first big wins, compared notes on surviving in a boys' club that mistook our precision for coldness, our refusal to giggle at bad jokes for lack of humor. Now she stood there with papers that included a non-disclosure agreement so comprehensive it might as well have been a gag order. The severance package is generous, she added, as if I cared about their hush money. I signed where indicated, my signature as steady as my pulse. Let them think they'd bought my silence. Let them think they'd neutralized the threat. They'd learn soon enough that I didn't need to speak to destroy them. I just needed them to have given me a reason. The rain hit me as soon as I stepped outside, a February deluge that soaked through my coat in seconds. I didn't run for cover. Instead, I stood there on the sidewalk, letting the water wash over me while the Calder and Voss Tower loomed behind like a glass and steel monument to greed. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. But I recognized the style, minimal words, maximum impact. Jude never wasted characters. Heard the news. Coffee? I typed back with one thumb, the other hand protecting my phone from the rain. Not coffee. War. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, my kind of Monday morning, I smiled for the first time all day. It wasn't a nice smile. If anyone from Calder and Voss had seen it, they might have realized their mistake. They thought they'd fired a risk analyst. What they'd actually done was create their biggest risk. By the time I reached my car, I'd already begun calculating. 48 hours until the Stratodyne deal closed. 48 hours to turn their billion-dollar baby into a financial funeral pyre. Some people might have spent the weekend grieving their career, questioning their worth, wondering what they'd done wrong. Me. I spent it planning exactly how to make them pay. I wasn't always this calculating. Once, I believed that hard work and integrity would be enough. That delusion died somewhere between my childhood in Detroit's East Side and my first year at Calder and Voss. Growing up, I learned mathematics from necessity, calculating which bills could wait, how many overtime shifts my mother needed to keep our heat on, the exact GPA required for a full scholarship anywhere that wasn't there. Our apartment was small enough that I could hear my mother crying through the walls when she thought I was asleep. She never cried during the day. During the day, she was titanium. "You're twice as smart as those rich kids," she'd tell me, braiding my hair before school. "But you'll have to work 4 times as hard to get half as far." She was wrong about the ratios. It was more like 10 times as hard for a quarter of the recognition. I earned that Harvard MBA with perfect grades and a stomach full of ulcers. While my classmates networked at country clubs, I worked graveyard shifts at a call center, studying between angry customer calls. Professor Morrison once asked why I looked exhausted during his 8 a.m. derivatives class. I told him I'd been up late studying. I didn't mention it was because I'd just finished a 12-hour shift. My first job at Goldman Sachs lasted 18 months, long enough to learn that being right meant nothing if you were the wrong gender delivering bad news. I'd flagged issues with the Techdyne acquisition, irregularities that would later trigger an SEC investigation. My male colleague, who'd initially dismissed my concerns, presented my findings as his own and got promoted. I got a lateral move to broaden my experience. 3 firms later, I arrived at Calder and Voss with scar tissue where my optimism used to be. By then, I'd learned to document everything, trust no one, and never mistake professional courtesy for friendship. The men who ran these firms didn't see me as a threat. I was too quiet, too focused on the work, too uninterested in their golf outings and strip club bonding sessions. They mistook my isolation for weakness. Jude Rayner understood isolation differently. I'd met him 3 years ago when Calder and Voss tried to prosecute him for exposing their client's data breach. The client had been covering up customers' financial information being sold on the dark web. Jude had proof. What he lacked was a legal strategy that didn't end with him in federal prison. I wasn't supposed to help him. But I'd seen the evidence he'd gathered, recognized the meticulous documentation of someone who knew they'd only get one shot at the truth. So I'd quietly pointed out flaws in our case to legal, suggested angles that unraveled our position. The charges were dropped. Jude walked free. He found me a month later at a coffee shop near my apartment. "I know what you did," he'd said, sliding uninvited into the seat across from me. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure." He'd smiled, pushing a business card across the table, no name, just a phone number. "For when you need someone who appreciates precision." I'd kept the card, though I never expected to use it. Jude existed in the gray spaces of technology, not quite criminal, never quite legitimate. A ghost in the machine who understood that sometimes the system couldn't be reformed, only burned down and rebuilt. That card lived in my wallet for 3 years. Through promotions that came too slowly, bonuses that were half what my male colleagues received, meetings where my analyses were ignored until restated by deeper voices. Through the Brennan account, where I'd prevented a $40 million loss and watched Roger Steinberg receive the recognition. Through 100 small cuts that bled my faith in meritocracy dry. The worst part wasn't the discrimination. It was the gaslighting, the constant implications that I was too sensitive, too rigid, too unable to be a team player. As if being a team player meant watching them juggle live grenades and saying nothing when shrapnel headed for investors' faces. My personal life became collateral damage. David, the last man I'd tried to date, had called me emotionally unavailable. He wasn't wrong. It's hard to be vulnerable when you spend 60 hours a week in armor. When showing weakness at work meant being labeled too emotional for finance, while showing strength meant being called a cold bitch. "You care more about your spreadsheets than people," he'd said during our final fight. "My spreadsheets don't lie to me," I'd responded. That was 2 years ago. Since then, my apartment had become a sanctuary of silence and order. No one to perform for, no one to manage, no one to disappoint. Just me, my work, and the knowledge that I was very, very good at what I did. Or had been, Until Friday afternoon. Now, sitting in my home office with rain still drumming against the windows, I pulled out Jude's card. 3 years of waiting for the right moment. Turns out, the right moment feels like drowning in someone else's greed. I'd never wanted revenge before. I'd wanted fairness, recognition, respect. But those were requests. And I was done requesting. They'd fired the woman who saved them from themselves. Time to show them what I did to people who crossed me. Saturday morning arrived with deceptive calm. I met Jude at a diner in Queens, far from Grayford's financial district where someone might recognize us. He looked exactly the same as 3 years ago. Unremarkable features, forgettable clothes, the kind of face that could disappear into any crowd. It's what made him perfect at what he did. "Show me," he said without preamble, sliding into the booth across from me. I passed him the USB drive under the table like we were Cold War spies. He pocketed it smoothly, then pulled out a laptop that looked like it had survived several wars. "Public Wi-Fi?" I asked. "Please." He looked offended. "I'm bouncing through 7 proxies and 3 continents. The NSA couldn't trace this if they tried." While he worked, I outlined my plan. It wasn't enough to expose the fraud. That would take months of investigation, lawyers, bureaucracy. Calder and Voss would find ways to distance themselves, claim ignorance, throw some mid-level executive under the bus. No, I needed the deal to implode spectacularly, publicly, and in a way that pointed directly back to their willful negligence. "I need you to create an automated system," I told him. "Something that will disseminate the evidence to multiple parties simultaneously, but only after I trigger it." His fingers never stopped moving across the keyboard. "Dead man's switch?" "More like a controlled demolition. I want to be able to choose the exact moment of detonation." He smiled without looking up. "You've thought about this." "I've had 36 hours of unemployment to get creative." What I didn't tell him was that I'd been wargaming scenarios since Tuesday. When I'd first realized they were going to bury my report, every commute, every sleepless night, I'd been building this plan piece by piece, like a chess player visualizing moves ahead. Except the board was the financial market and the pieces were people's careers. "Here's what I can do," Jude said after 20 minutes of silence. "I'll create a smart contract, blockchain-based, immutable once deployed. You'll have a trigger phrase. When you send that phrase from any verified device, the system activates emails to the SEC, FBI, Treasury, and IRS, media packages to the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and Bloomberg. Everything encrypted, time-stamped, and verified authentic." "How long do I have after triggering?" 15 minutes before the first wave hits. 30 before it's everywhere. Once it starts, it can't be stopped. Perfect. Enough time to be somewhere visible when the explosion started, establishing my alibi. "There's more," I said. "I need you to create a ghost profile, someone who could plausibly be an insider at Stratodyne. Backstop it with enough digital history to survive casual scrutiny." "You're going to approach them directly?" He looked up for the first time, impressed. "Balls." I prefer to think of it as strategic misdirection. While everyone's looking at the fake insider, no one's looking at me. We spent the next 3 hours building the identity. Sarah Chen, a mid-level financial analyst at Stratodyne, who'd discovered the same irregularities I had. Concerned about her company being acquired under false pretenses, Jude created email accounts, LinkedIn profiles, even a sparse but believable social media presence dating back years. "This is artwork," he said, admiring his creation. "She's boring enough to be real, but positioned perfectly to know about the fraud." Phase 2 required a different kind of deception. I contacted 3 journalists I'd fed stories to over the years, all hungry for the kind of exclusive that made careers. I pitched each a different angle: corporate malfeasance, national security concerns, investor fraud. The beautiful thing about the truth is that it has many faces, all equally devastating. But the masterpiece would be my approach to Morrison Equity Partners, Calder and Voss's biggest competitor. They'd lost the Stratadine bid and were still smarting from it. I scheduled a meeting for Sunday afternoon, using my real name and former title. When they asked why I was no longer with Calder and Voss, I'd tell them I'd resigned over ethical concerns with certain transactions. Not a lie, not a violation of my NDA, just enough truth to make them curious. By Saturday evening, the architecture of destruction was complete. Jude had given me the trigger phrase, a quote from Oppenheimer that felt appropriate. Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds. Type that into any email client, send it to a specific address, and Calder and Voss would learn what happened when you fired someone who knew all your secrets. You sure about this? Jude asked as we prepared to leave. Once this goes live, there's no walking it back. They'll know it was you, NDA or not. Let them know, I said. Let them prove it. Everything I'm releasing is true, documented, and in the public interest. If they want to sue me for telling the truth, they'll have to admit the truth exists. He shook his head. Remind me never to piss you off. You helped me when no one else would, I said. You're safe. And them? I thought about David's condescending smile, Roger's casual theft of my work, the entire system that had tried to make me small enough to swallow. They're about to learn why you don't fire the person who knows where the bodies are buried. The rain had stopped by the time I left the diner. The sky was clearing, revealing stars usually hidden by city lights. Somewhere across town, the executives of Calder and Voss were probably celebrating their impending deal, confident they'd eliminated the only threat to their payday. They had no idea their countdown had already started. Sunday began with calculated precision. I wore my second-best suit to meet Morrison Equity Partners. The best would have seemed desperate. James Morrison himself attended, along with his head of acquisitions. They'd cleared their Sunday afternoon for me. That alone told me they smelled blood in the water. Evelyn, Morrison said, pouring coffee from a crystal carafe. I was surprised to hear you'd left Calder and Voss. Poaching you has been on my wish list for years. I wasn't fired, I said carefully. I resigned over ethical concerns. His eyes sharpened. The Stratadine deal? I sipped my coffee. Let silence do the work. In negotiations, the first person to speak loses. We know you were their lead analyst on it. His acquisition head, Patricia Reeves, pressed. We also know the deal stinks. We just can't prove it. Hypothetically, I said, if someone had proof that Stratadine's valuation was built on fabricated DoD contracts, falsified technology patents, and beneficial ownership that traces back to sanctioned entities, what would that be worth to Morrison Equity? Morrison leaned back in his chair. Hypothetically, it would be worth ensuring that person had a very comfortable future. Senior partner comfortable. I don't want a job, I said. I want justice. Sometimes they're the same thing, I smiled. Not this time. But if Calder and Voss were to suddenly face regulatory scrutiny, and if Stratadine became available at a fire sale price, the real price, not the fantasy they're peddling, would Morrison Equity be interested? We'd be first in line, Patricia said. Then you might want to clear your Monday morning. I left without making any commitments, but I'd planted the seed. Morrison Equity would be watching, waiting, ready to pounce when the blood hit the water. They'd get Stratadine for pennies on the dollar, cleaned of its criminal elements. The market would get a cautionary tale about due diligence. Everyone would win, everyone except Calder and Voss. The Financial Journalism Conference at the Marriott Marquise was my next stop. Emerging Risks in Private Equity. I'd registered weeks ago, back when I thought I'd be attending as Calder and Voss's representative. Now I walked in as a ghost with a bomb. The afternoon panel on due diligence was perfect. 300 financial professionals, dozen journalists. And, I smiled when I saw him, David Calder himself, scheduled to speak about innovation in risk assessment. I took a seat in the middle, invisible, in the crowd. David spoke for 20 minutes about Calder and Voss's proprietary methods for evaluating deals. He used slides I'd created, strategies I'd developed, even case studies where I'd saved them from disaster, all presented as his own work. When he opened for questions, I stood. Mr. Calder, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the conference room. Can you speak to how your proprietary methods evaluated the Stratodyne Systems acquisition? He recognized me then. His face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, fear, before settling on professional calm. I'm not at liberty to discuss ongoing transactions, he said. Of course. But hypothetically, how would your methods handle falsified defense contracts or beneficial ownership by sanctioned entities? Just curious about the theoretical approach. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Journalists started typing. David's jaw clenched. As I said, I can't discuss specific deals. Next question? But I'd done what I came for. Half the financial press now had Stratodyne and fraud in the same mental sentence. They'd be primed for tomorrow's revelations. I spent Sunday evening in my apartment, finalizing everything. The email with the trigger phrase was drafted. Waiting. News alerts were set up to track mentions of Calder and Voss, Stratodyne, and key executives. My resignation letter from Friday was framed on my desk, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder that they'd fired the wrong person. At 11:47 p.m., I made my final preparation. I called the SEC's whistleblower hotline and left a detailed voicemail, outlining my concerns about the Stratodyne acquisition. I gave my real name, my former title, and stated clearly that I'd been terminated after raising these concerns internally. The call would be logged, time-stamped, creating an official record before my automated system activated. When investigators eventually pieced together the timeline, they'd find a concerned analyst who'd tried proper channels first. The fact that those channels had been mysteriously flooded with comprehensive evidence hours later? Coincidence. I'd been fired Friday afternoon. How could I have orchestrated something so complex? Midnight came and went. In 6 hours, Calder and Voss would open for pre-market trading. In 8 hours, they'd be preparing for the biggest deal of their year. In 9 hours, I'd send an email that would end them. I poured myself a glass of wine, the good stuff, saved for special occasions. Tomorrow, I'd watch an empire burn. Tonight, I'd savor the anticipation. My phone buzzed. Jude. System armed, ready when you are. I typed back, Monday morning can't come soon enough. But that wasn't quite true. The waiting was delicious too. Somewhere in Grayford, David Calder was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of his billion-dollar victory. Roger Steinberg was likely planning how to spend his bonus. The entire board of Calder and Voss was hours away from their triumph. They had no idea their executioner was sitting in a modest apartment, wearing pajamas and sipping Pinot Noir. Finger poised over a button that would end everything they'd built on lies. I'd spent 15 years being their shield. Monday. I'd show them what it meant to be their sword. Monday arrived wrapped in fog, as if the universe had decided to set the mood. I woke at 5:30 a.m., my internal clock still synced to Calder and Voss's rhythms. Pre-market trading would begin in an hour. The Stratodyne signing was scheduled for 9 a.m. I dressed carefully, a navy suit that meant business. Pearl earrings my mother had given me when I graduated Harvard. For days when you need to remind them who you are, she'd said. Today, I'd remind them who they'd thrown away. At 6:15 a.m., I sat at my breakfast bar with coffee and my laptop, watching the markets wake up. Calder and Voss stock was up 3% in pre-market trading, anticipation of the Stratodyne deal driving investor optimism. Trading volume was higher than usual. The sharks were circling, smelling money. At 6:45 a.m., I opened my email client and typed in the trigger phrase, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." My finger hovered over the send button. 15 years of my life had led to this moment. Every sleepless night, every stolen idea, every casual dismissal had been a step toward this precipice. I hit send. The confirmation was anticlimactic, just a small whoosh sound and the email disappearing from my drafts. But I knew that across the digital landscape, Jude's program was awakening. Encrypted files were being unlocked, emails were being formatted, media packages were being prepared. 7 a.m. I pulled up my news feeds. Nothing yet, 7:05 a.m. Bloomberg flashed a breaking news alert. SEC receives whistleblower complaint regarding Calder and Voss acquisition. 7:08 a.m. The Wall Street Journal updated their homepage. Questions emerge about defense contractor Stratadyne Systems, hours before major acquisition. 7:12 a.m. My phone started buzzing. Unknown numbers, probably reporters who'd connected the dots between the SEC complaint and my Friday termination. I let them go to voicemail. 7:15 a.m. The tsunami hit. Breaking: FBI Financial Crimes Division confirms investigation into Calder and Voss Capital. Exclusive. Documents show Stratadyne Systems falsified Defense Department contracts. Urgent. Treasury Department examining possible sanctions violations in billion-dollar deal. I switched to CNBC. The morning anchors were scrambling, pulling in experts to discuss the unfolding situation. Calder and Voss stock had stopped trading, down 18% in minutes. Someone had leaked, or more accurately, I had strategically disseminated, internal emails where David Calder explicitly instructed staff to ignore compliance concerns. At 7:25 a.m., my former colleague Marcus texted, "Holy shit, Evelyn, did you see the news?" I responded, "Just waking up. What's happening?" Let them all think I was as surprised as everyone else. 7:30 a.m. brought the death blow. The Financial Times published a detailed exposé. My documentation transformed into a devastating narrative. They'd found the shell companies, traced the money to sanctioned oligarchs, even uncovered connections I'd missed. Real investigative journalists with resources had taken my blueprint and built a masterpiece of destruction. The conference at the Marriott Marquis had transformed into an impromptu crisis center. Financial professionals who'd heard my questions yesterday were being interviewed, confirming that someone had publicly challenged Calder about Stratadyne just hours before the scandal broke. The speculation was delicious. Who was the mysterious woman who'd known what was coming? At 7:45 a.m., Stratadyne Systems released a statement. In light of serious allegations regarding misrepresentations in our acquisition process, we are terminating all negotiations with Calder and Voss Capital effective immediately. We will cooperate fully with all investigations. The rats were fleeing the sinking ship. 8 a.m., the moment of peak chaos. Every financial news outlet was covering the story. Calder and Voss's website had crashed under traffic. Their phones were presumably ringing off the hook, and somewhere in their gleaming tower, David Calder was watching his empire crumble in real time. My phone rang. Margaret from legal. "Evelyn," she said, voice tight with panic. "We need to discuss your separation agreement." "I'm sorry. Who is this?" I asked pleasantly. "Margaret C. from legal. Listen, there's been a misunderstanding about your termination. David wants to discuss reinstatement immediately." "I'm confused. I was fired for poor performance and failure to align with company vision. What's changed?" "Please, Evelyn. You know what's happening. They need you." "I signed an NDA," I reminded her. "I couldn't help even if I wanted to, which I don't." "The NDA can be waived." I hung up. Let them drown in their own bureaucracy. 8:30 a.m. The FBI raid began. I watched on the news as agents carried boxes out of Calder and Voss's offices. The same building I'd been escorted from 3 days ago was now a crime scene. The poetry of it was almost too perfect. Morrison Equity Partners released a statement expressing grave concerns about market integrity and announcing their readiness to provide stability through strategic acquisitions. James Morrison was already positioning to buy Stratadyne's carcass. I'd given him exactly what he wanted: a competitor's destruction and a fire sale opportunity. By 9 a.m., when the Stratadyne deal should have been signed, Calder and Voss stock had lost 67% of its value. Trading was halted indefinitely. Congressional representatives were calling for hearings. The Southern District of New York had opened a criminal investigation. I made myself a second cup of coffee and ate breakfast while watching the coverage. Every journalist was asking the same question. How had this information suddenly appeared everywhere at once? The sophistication suggested an insider. but the timing suggested someone with nothing left to lose. My neighbor knocked, Mrs. Patterson, who'd always been kind to me. Evelyn, dear, isn't that your company on the news? Former company, I corrected. They let me go on Friday. Her eyes widened. Before all this happened, oh honey, you're lucky to be out of there. Yes, I agreed. Very lucky. By noon, 3 more executives had been arrested. Investors were filing emergency lawsuits. The board had called an emergency meeting to discuss bankruptcy options. In less than 6 hours, Calder and Voss had gone from Wall Street darling to cautionary tale. I ordered Thai food and settled in to watch the afternoon coverage. My phone had logged 47 missed calls, journalists, former colleagues, probably lawyers. None of them mattered now. The only message I returned was Jude's. Watching the news, this is better than Christmas. I texted back, just wait for the finale. Because this was only Act 1. The investigations would take months, maybe years, but they'd find everything, every crime, every cover-up, every arrogant decision to prioritize profit over principle. And at the center of it all would be the evidence that I'd tried to give them, that they'd fired me for finding. They'd burned the messenger. Now they could burn with the message. The 9 a.m. FBI raid was just the opening salvo. By 2 p.m., the Securities and Exchange Commission had frozen all Calder and Voss accounts pending investigation. The IRS announced they were examining 5 years of returns. The dominoes weren't just falling, they were exploding. I watched from my apartment as news helicopters circled the Calder and Voss building. Federal agents formed a perimeter, checking IDs of anyone trying to leave. Through the live feed, I could see employees evacuating with bankers' boxes, the same walk of shame I'd done Friday. Except they were leaving as suspects, not scapegoats. At 3:17 p.m., the moment I'd been waiting for arrived. David Calder, in handcuffs, being led to a federal vehicle. His Armani suit looked less impressive, accessorized with restraints. Roger Steinberg followed minutes later. His trademark smirk replaced by something between shock and rage. The news anchor was breathless. In an unprecedented collapse, Calder and Voss Capital, once valued at over $2 billion, has effectively ceased to exist. Sources inside the investigation tell us the evidence appears to have been compiled by someone with intimate knowledge of the firm's operations. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, but I recognized the format, one of David's burner phones. You did this, I typed back. Prove it. You signed an NDA, which prevents me from disclosing proprietary information. Truth about crimes isn't proprietary. Your lawyers should have written better contracts. The typing indicator pulsed for a long time. Then, you destroyed hundreds of jobs. No, I replied. You did. I just stopped you from destroying more. At 4 p.m., something unexpected happened. A CNBC reporter mentioned my name on air, not as a suspect, but as a victim. Someone had leaked that I'd been terminated hours after presenting evidence about Stratadine. The narrative was writing itself. Whistleblower fired for doing her job. Company collapsing under the weight of what she'd found. Margaret called again. This time, I answered. Evelyn, the FBI wants to speak with you. I'm sure they do. As a witness, she clarified quickly. They know you tried to stop this. Then they know more than the board did. Evelyn. Her voice cracked. I'm sorry. We all are. I should have. No. I cut her off. You made your choice Friday. You chose your paycheck over your integrity. Now, live with it. By 5 p.m., the first insider had flipped. Timothy Marsh, CFO, in exchange for immunity, was detailing exactly how the fraud worked. His confession matched my documentation perfectly because of course it did. I'd written the roadmap he was now following to save himself. The final nail came at 6:23 p.m. The Department of Justice announced charges under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Calder and Voss hadn't just facilitated a bad deal. They'd knowingly engaged with sanctioned entities. That meant potential criminal charges for everyone who'd touched the deal. Everyone except the analyst who'd tried to stop it. At 7 p.m., I finally left my apartment. I needed wine, good wine, to properly toast the occasion. The liquor store owner, who knew me as a regular customer, had the news on. "Crazy about that investment firm," he said, ringing up a bottle of champagne I'd selected. "Makes you wonder who else is doing this stuff." "Probably everyone," I said. "You work in finance, right? You okay?" "I'm unemployed as of Friday," I said truthfully. "Best thing that ever happened to me." Walking home, I felt the weight of the USB drive still in my pocket. Evidence of evidence, proof that I'd tried the right way first. My insurance policy, though I doubted I'd need it now. The FBI would find the same breadcrumbs in Calder and Voss's servers, see my reports, my emails, my escalations. The record would show Evelyn Mercer as the only person who'd tried to prevent disaster. My phone had one last message from James Morrison. "Drinks when the dust settles. We have a senior partner position that needs someone with your particular skills." I deleted it without responding. They still didn't understand. This wasn't about finding a better master. It was about burning down the whole corrupt temple. Back in my apartment, I opened the champagne and poured a glass. Through my window, I could see the lights of the financial district. Somewhere in that glittering landscape, lawyers were frantically trying to save what couldn't be saved. Investigators were following trails I'd illuminated. Executives were realizing their golden parachutes had been shredded. The news updated, shareholders had filed a class action lawsuit. The bankruptcy filing would come within days. Hundreds of employees would lose their jobs, but thousands of investors would be saved from a catastrophic fraud. The mathematics of justice. At 9 p.m., exactly 12 hours after the Stratadine deal should have been signed, Calder and Voss Capital officially ceased trading. The company that had existed for 47 years, that had weathered recessions and scandals, had been destroyed in a single day by a woman they deemed expendable. I raised my glass to the window, to the city, to everyone who'd ever been told they were too aggressive, too meticulous, too unwilling to play along. To alignment with company vision, I said aloud, and drank. The champagne tasted like vindication. 3 weeks later, I sat in my favorite coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from the financial district's shadow. The barista, who knew my order by heart, brought over my usual black coffee, no sugar, no cream. Some things didn't need to be complicated. Jude slid into the seat across from me, newspaper in hand. The headlines had evolved from shock to analysis. The Calder collapse, a timeline of greed. Read 1. How one analyst saved American investors billions, read another. "They're calling you the ghost of Wall Street," he said, showing me an article where reporters had tried to piece together who'd compiled the evidence. "Anonymous sources say it had to be an insider, but no one can prove anything." "Good," I said. "The FBI cleared you yesterday," he continued. "Official statement says you were terminated before any leaks occurred, making you an unlikely suspect." I smiled at that. Being fired had become my alibi. The very act meant to silence me had given me the perfect cover. "What's next?" Jude asked. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket, the one I'd carried for 3 weeks, and slid it across the table. "Destroy this." "You sure?" "It's over. They're done." The numbers were staggering. 17 executives charged. 800 million in assets frozen. 2,000 jobs lost. Collateral damage I didn't celebrate but couldn't have prevented. They'd have lost those jobs anyway when the Stratadine fraud eventually surfaced. At least now, they could find new positions without criminal investigations haunting their resumes. David Calder was facing 30 years. Roger Steinberg had fled to a non-extradition country, abandoning his family and his fortune. The board members were turning on each other, each claiming ignorance while producing evidence of the other's guilt. "Morrison still calling?" Jude asked. "Every day. So are 7 other firms. And..." I looked out the window at ordinary people living ordinary lives. For 15 years, I'd defined myself by my work, by my title. buy my place in a system that had never wanted me there. I'm done playing their games, I said. All of them. The good firms, the bad firms, they're all built on the same foundation. They all want the person who can spot the bodies, but will help bury them when asked. So what will you do? I thought about the teaching offer from Columbia, the consulting opportunities with the SEC, the book deal 3 publishers had quietly proposed. Options I'd never had when I was just another analyst in an expensive suit. Maybe I'll teach, I said. Show the next generation how to spot the rot before it spreads. My phone buzzed. Another unknown number. I'd stopped answering them weeks ago. Journalists, lawyers, curiosity seekers, none of them mattered now. The story was written. The verdict was in. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence. Outside, New York churned on, indifferent to the collapse of one more corrupt institution. The city had seen empires rise and fall. It would see more. As I stood to leave, Jude asked, "Any regrets?" I thought about Friday afternoon, standing in the rain, fury burning hot enough to evaporate every drop. I thought about 15 years of excellence rewarded with dismissal. I thought about every woman who'd been told she was difficult when she was just right. No, I said. They made their choice. I made mine. And if they'd listened, if they'd acted on your report, then Calder and Voss would still exist. Stratadine would have been exposed through proper channels, and I'd probably still be working 60-hour weeks for people who saw me as a necessary evil. So they did you a favor. They did everyone a favor. They showed exactly who they were. I left the coffee shop and walked toward the subway. My phone rang one more time, a number I recognized. Marcus, the security guard who'd escorted me out. I answered. "Hello, Marcus." "Ms. Mercer," he said, voice warm. "I just wanted to say, my daughter's been following the news. She says you're her hero, says she wants to be just like you when she grows up." "Tell her to be better than me," I said. "Tell her to be the person who prevents the crime, not the one who avenges it." "I will." "And Ms. Mercer?" We all knew. Everyone who worked there knew you were the smartest person in the building. They just couldn't stand that you were also the most honest. After we hung up, I stood on the subway platform, watching trains come and go. Each one could take me somewhere new, somewhere I'd never been. For the first time in 15 years, I had no meetings to attend, no reports to file, no fires to fight. I was 36 years old, unemployed, and completely free. The USB drive was gone. The evidence was with the proper authorities. The guilty were facing justice. The complicit were facing unemployment. The innocent, if any existed in that building, were free to find better places to work. I'd been fired on a Friday for refusing to bury the truth. By Monday, I'd buried them instead. The train arrived, doors opening to possibility. I stepped inside, found a seat, and closed my eyes. Somewhere in the city, investigators were still sorting through the wreckage. Lawyers were still negotiating plea deals. Journalists were still chasing stories. But I was done burning things down. It was time to see what I could build from the ashes. I didn't need to be heard anymore. I'd already said everything that mattered. The train pulled away from the platform, carrying me toward whatever came next. Behind me, the financial district grew smaller, its towers less imposing with distance. They'd thought they were writing me out of the story. Instead, I'd written the ending. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate revenge and justice served cold. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of a woman who refused to be silenced, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts on what you would have done in Evelyn's position. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share more stories with you.